Giuliani. Sit.
Robert Shackney of CBS News. Judy Woodruff, Chief Washington Correspondent for the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour and the anchor of the PBS documentary program Frontline. Joe Witt, General in the Department of Justice, Criminal Division. Gil Klein of Media General Newspapers is the chairman of the club's. Joe Voles of the New York Daily News, and Eleanor Clift of Newsweek. In 1975, Executive Assistant U.S. Attorney, then the third highest position in that office. Now, later that year, he came to Washington during the Ford administration to become an Associate Deputy Attorney. He was responsible for the Criminal Division. But he gave this up in 1983 to the surprise of many to return to Manhattan, where he became the U.S. Attorney. In New York, he supervises 133 assistant U.S. attorneys, 90 of them in the Criminal Division. Speaker today by one of his less frequently used titles, one of the world's greatest news sources, Mr. Rudolph Giuliani.
Thank you very much. It's nice of all of you to be here. I grew up in Brooklyn. Actually, that happens from listening to all those tapes. The references to Eliot Ness and Tom Dewey kind of amuse me because Eliot Ness, I remember from years of watching The Untouchables, and on Sunday night, my wife and I went to see the new movie, The Untouchables, which I highly recommend because it's a lot of fun. But I was standing online waiting to buy my ticket with everyone else, and this gentleman recognized me and came up to me and he said, "Geez, you'd think they'd at least give you a free pass to the movie." The thing that I've been trying to do for months, because several times when I've been introduced and compared to Tom Dewey, is to find something funny to say about Tom Dewey. And it required a lot more legal research than working out a lot of theories that we use in racketeering cases and insider trading cases. But I found one story that may, in fact, be true. At least it was written in a book, so it has some authoritative support for it. On the evening of the election returns in 1948, Mr. and Mrs. Dewey were having dinner alone before they went down to join their friends. And toward the end of dinner, he leaned over to her and said, "Mrs. Dewey," which is apparently what he called her, "Mrs. Dewey, do you realize that tomorrow night you will be sleeping with the next president of the United States? Don't you think that'll be exciting?" And she looked at him and said, "Mr. Dewey, I guess it will be." They went down with their friends and they watched the election returns, and of course, as you all know, they went to bed that night thinking that he was going to be the next president of the United States, with the headline in the Chicago Tribune that Dewey had defeated Truman. When they got up the next morning, there was a knock at the door. There was a woman bringing breakfast in and a newspaper. She gave the newspaper first to Mrs. Dewey, and of course it said, "Truman defeats Dewey." She handed the newspaper to her husband, and displaying a much better sense of humor than I imagined he ever had, she said to him, "Mr. Dewey, should I call Harry Truman or should I wait for Harry Truman to call me?" I'm going to try very, very hard to speak for only 20 minutes. And if I do, I expect you to applaud me because I'm a trial lawyer by training, and therefore 20 minutes becomes 40, and 40 becomes an hour and a half, and an hour and a half becomes 2. But I'm going to try very hard to keep my remarks brief so that we have as much time for your questions as possible. And I'm going to talk in a general way about the problem of crime in the United States because, unfortunately, that's the problem that I spend most of my time dealing with and knowing the most about. And I think what I will do is give you some examples of areas in which I think the government has been very effective in dealing with the problem of crime, and then some examples of where we haven't been as effective, maybe to suggest some other things that we should be doing and that our society should be doing as a whole to deal with these problems more effectively. There's no doubt that the problem of crime, violent crime or white-collar crime, drug-related crime or business-related crime, corruption in public office or private office, has become a major problem for America in the 1980s. It may very well be that we now find out more about the crimes that we commit, rather than that we just commit more crime. But whatever the historical answer to it is, there's no doubt that America in the 1980s faces a crime problem that is a major social problem for us. Americans, roughly, murder each other 10 times more than Englishmen and 20 times more than citizens of Japan. We commit violent crimes at rates that are astounding in comparison to other Western countries and in comparison to other nations with which we would like to compare ourselves. And I believe that those rates for violent crime, which are ascertainable and somewhat more objective than any rates or statistics that I could give you about white-collar crime, roughly parallel the levels at which we commit violations of serious laws against various kinds of financial crimes. It says to us that if America doesn't take the problem seriously and doesn't begin to turn around both the reality and the image that it's presenting of a society that is lawless, there isn't going to be much of a future for the young people of America. Nothing disturbs me more than to see all of the revelations of crime committed by some of the most powerful and some of the wealthiest members of our society than the thought and the knowledge that during a period of one's life, namely during the period of time that you're going to school and growing up, people develop impressions and images, and they develop ideas about what they want to do with the future of their lives. And looking at America today and the crimes that are revealed on the part of some of the wealthiest and some of the most powerful people in our society doesn't bode well for the kinds of desires and the kinds of notions that people are going to develop about public service. Crime is a complex problem, and that doesn't mean that it's a problem that cannot be dealt with. It means that it's a problem that is going to require a lot more than a few quick fixes or a few slogans to really turn around. And unfortunately, that's the way we relate to the crime problem. By we, I don't just mean government. I don't just mean the media. I mean both of those, but I'm referring to society in general. We take what is, in fact, a complex problem, and for purposes of dealing with it in a way that reduces the frustration level, we simplify it so that politicians talk about poverty causing crime, ignoring the fact that in times of greatest poverty, statistically, we've gone through periods of the least amount of crime. So that has to at least suggest that the simple solution or the simple statement that poverty causes crime, and if we just had more jobs, we would have less violent crime, probably isn't a truism the way it's stated by a lot of politicians. Other politicians seize on the death penalty as if it's the answer to income tax evasion and use it as a way of its being their entire and complete program to what to do about crime. The media, I must say respectfully, covers crime generally in a repetitious and sensationalized way without dealing with some of the complex, more difficult issues that are involved in the problem of crime. If you compare the work that is done in the media with regard to foreign policy and the economy, both on television and in newspapers and in the ways Americans get information, with the level of coverage of crime, you can see part of what I'm saying. We do not educate the American people to understand some of the core underlying issues, whether we're dealing with violent crime, white-collar crime, political corruption, because we largely deal with it in a more sensationalized way. Now, there are examples to the contrary, but by and large, if you were to compare foreign policy, the economy, and then the crime problem, the way politicians and the way the media generally relate to all three of those problems reveals some of the lack of education that Americans have about some of the more fundamental issues that are involved in the problem of crime. But if there's one thing that I think has made it very, very difficult for us to deal realistically and maturely with the problem of crime, it's the rhetoric of the 1960s. The wars on crime, the wars on poverty, the use of a language like that to deal with a very complex issue. You cannot wage war on crime because you are going to lose that war. If you talk about it in language of unconditional victory or the alternative being defeat, well, then society is constantly going to be defeated and is constantly going to be losing. Crime has been with us since the beginning of humanity. It'll be with us until the end. And we can't talk about it in language of suggesting that there are going to be unconditional victories against crime. What we have to do is talk about how to reduce the problem of crime. America is not going to eliminate entirely Americans murdering other Americans. But America does not have to tolerate Americans murdering other Americans 10 times more than Englishmen and 20 times more than citizens of Japan, or in anything roughly equating to those kinds of comparisons. And the same thing is true of each one of the other types of crime that we deal with: organized crime, financial crime, political corruption. Nothing I do, nothing that all of the United States attorneys in the United States or that have ever been here or will be here in the future, nothing that district attorneys do or police departments do or the media does or private institutions of society will do in the future is going to eliminate any of those problems. But what we can do is reduce it, and reduce it dramatically. And that's the kind of goal that we have to set, and the way in which we have to deal with government policy to reduce the amount of crime, and with the values and the things that have to be done in the private areas of our society. In several areas, I think the government, during the last 4 or 5 years, has made dramatic contributions in reducing certain areas of crime. And it's worth spending a minute or two in those areas because it offers a lesson or a model as to what we can be doing in those other areas where we have not been making the same kind of inroads. First, let me talk briefly about the problem of organized crime. What I said about crime in general, that it's inherent in human society, and that it is something that has been with us from the beginning and will be with us from the end, is not true of organized crime. There is nothing necessary about organized crime. In the late 1950s, Robert Kennedy described organized crime in America as a government within our legitimate government, as an arbitrary exercise of power by a group of people who are in essence exercising governmental power, making decisions about who will live, who will die, making decisions about how much money people should pay for the right to conduct a lawful and legitimate business, making decisions about who should run various parts of and then eventually the entire leadership of a labor union. Those are powers that in a democracy are given to lawful authority, not to hoodlums. We permitted that to happen. It did not happen accidentally. It did not happen by some kind of supernatural force. It happened because we watched it happen and let it happen in the 1920s and the 1930s and the 1940s and the 1950s, while at the federal level we were denying the existence of organized crime, while we were pretending, for whatever reasons, and I'm not sure I know the reasons, but while we were pretending that it didn't exist. And what changed that? Why is the picture somewhat different today? And the picture is somewhat different today. I'm not saying that the effort against organized crime is over, or that it's been won, or that it ever will be won. But certainly in the last 4, 5, 6 years, there have been more convictions, more imprisonments, and more damage done to the structure of organized crime in America than ever before in our history, and that continues to go on, not only in my city, but throughout the United States, in all of those areas where organized crime has been powerful in the past. And many of their weapons have been taken away from them, and many of their means and methods of dealing with each other have been deprived. Now, why did that happen in the 1980s and not earlier, when it could have been actually more effective because they would have been dealing with a much smaller problem? It really happened because America did not recognize sufficiently and develop the national commitment to deal with the problem. We did not organize ourselves. We did not deal with it as a national, federal problem of the first importance, a problem that is similar to some of the other problems that we have effectively dealt with. Starting in the late 1960s and throughout the 1970s, Congress made changes in the law to learn from the mistakes of the past. And starting in the late 70s and early 1980s, the Justice Department and other law enforcement agencies began aggressively and sensibly using the tools that had been given to them because there was a national commitment to get the job done, because we recognized it as a problem and we decided to give it the priority that it deserves. Now, let me tell you, surprisingly, that I think that very similar achievements, maybe not quite at the same level, but at least a lot faster than I thought would be the case, are occurring with regard to financial crime, particularly crimes involving securities fraud and insider trading. With the cases that have been brought, with the convictions that have been obtained, and with those things that are under investigations that are known to some of the entities that are involved in it, there have been major changes already made on the part of some financial institutions, and the financial community is addressing the problem in a very serious way, in a way that says, what can we do to make certain that this problem doesn't recur? What are some of the underlying changes that we have to make? Not every institution, regrettably, not across the board, but there has been what I would regard as a very, very quick awakening to the problem and movement in the direction of what are some of the fundamental things that have to be changed. And some institutions have set forth really what I would regard as models for how to deal with the problem. That's what I call success when you look at something that is as negative as prosecuting people for crimes and attempting to put them in prison, and then having to measure your success based on how many of them you put in prison. What I really regard as success is if the criminal process can act as a catalyst to the rest of society to see the problem and to move the rest of society, whether it's private institutions or other government agencies, to make the changes that give us some hope that the problem won't recur in the past. Now, where haven't we been as successful? We certainly have not been as successful in the area of political corruption. We have, in my office, been investigating political corruption in New York City and New York State for a longer period of time than financial crime. We have convicted considerably more people at a higher level. And the same response that we've had in the financial community to fewer convictions for a shorter period of time has not occurred within the political establishment in New York. And it leads me to the rather curious observation that the American political establishment, at least in my city, is less democratic and less open to democratic change than the financial community. That in fact, people and leaders in the financial community understand the need to maintain and increase within the public a reputation for honesty and integrity, and that the long-term future of their firms and their community turns to a very large extent on whether the vast majority of citizens accept them as people who are doing business honestly. Sure, there are exceptions to that, and sure, there are some that hide their head in the sand and don't understand that, but I have been impressed with how many do. On the other side, I have been equally surprised that the changes that are so obvious that have to be made in the way we practice politics and the way business intersects with politics in New York have not been made. You would be surprised probably to learn that New York State permits a level of criminal conduct and ethical behavior on the part of public officials that is not permitted under the laws of 38, 39 other states or under federal law. There are areas of conflict of interest, there are areas of financial disclosure, there are areas of bribery that are not illegal in New York, that are illegal in other states, in many other states, and that are felonies under federal law. You would also be surprised to know that after almost a year and a half of convictions of some of the major political figures in New York City and New York State, not indictments, not accusation, not newspaper stories, convictions beyond a reasonable doubt for federal felonies, the New York State legislature is yet to pass a law that makes criminal in New York those things that are criminal under the law of 38 or 40 other states or under federal law. That says to me that our future in New York will be, unless we change it, another cycle of corruption 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, and maybe in each one of those periods of time. And the only way we're going to change that, because it's the only way we really have in a democracy, is to change the law. If we change the law, if we enact those things that we can talk about in more detail if you have questions about it, if we do those things that other states have done, if we follow their lead and we close up these gaps, we're still going to have corrupt politicians, we're still going to have people who violate the law, but we're going to do two things that are very important. First of all, we're going to offer more opportunity to catch those who are and make examples out of them, which can operate at least on those who can't be persuaded any other way. And the second thing that we're going to do is we're going to reverse the terrible lesson that we're teaching in New York to young people day in and day out, which is that people in public office are hiding from, running away from, and having to be dragged, kicking and screaming, into making changes in the rules and the laws and in the rules of ethics that govern public officials. That is a terrible lesson to teach to impressionable young minds who are trying to figure out what to do with their lives, because what we're saying to them day in and day out is, it's no use going into politics, there's no use going into government, because you can't change anything. And I think that is something that can't be reversed. It can't be reversed by just waiting and being dragged into these things. It can only be done by political leadership and by leadership on the part of the people who are now obstructing all of those changes.